Most of the time, we don't really think about the gear we use when we go out fishing. We just do some research, buy a modern reel online, spool it up, and head out. It's simple and it works perfectly. It's made out of high-tech materials and metals, and it feels pretty disconnected from the past. But the way things are actually goes back hundreds of years, back to people just trying to figure things out in their workshops. So, to see what that was like, I'm attempting to build a 19th century style Nottingham fly reel as a complete amateur. I'm going to take you through the whole build process, mistakes and all, and then we're going to deep dive into the build, we're going to look at the history of it, and then we're going to compare my messy and ugly reel, to be honest, with some other ones that have been used throughout the years. I started with the walnut block, and it pretty quickly reminded me that I am not a pro. On my first attempt, my drill bit completely wandered off course because walnut is a pretty dense, tough hardwood, so the exit hole came out crooked on the back. I had to scrap it, grab my second block, and drill from both sides with the pilot hole so the holes would meet perfectly in the middle. Once the center hole was locked in, I used a handsaw to knock off the 4 sharp corners of the square block, which turned into a rough 8-sided octagon. Now, while you watch me rasp down this block into an attempted circle, I'm going to talk to you about why I'm using wood. So back in the mid-1800s in Nottingham, England, fishing reels were usually made out of heavy metal by specialized blacksmiths, meaning it was pretty hard to get your hands on, and usually only the wealthy could afford them. Making the spooling wood was a pretty big difference. Wood was cheap, easy to find, and everyday anglers could shape it using basic tools. By standing here with the wood rasp trying to get this block round, I'm dealing with the exact same material limits and trial and error that regular fishermen faced 170 years ago when they started making their own gear. With my walnut block finally rounded out, the next thing to do was to carve out the center channel which holds the fishing line. I first marked a 3/8 inch line from the edge of the reel and sawed around the sides to form the initial channel. With the channel outlined, I brought in the chisel. I worked my way around the reel until I was able to pop out rough, large chunks to get ready for sanding. Once the chiseling was done, I whipped out an 80 grit sandpaper and got to work smoothing it out. Alright, before we go into the next part, let's go back in time real quick. How much do you think fishing really has affected history as a whole, and how much impact has it had on the world? Well, for 99% of human history, fishing was a necessity and a part of life in many parts of the world. In fact, anthropologists have found that marine fats and proteins are what allowed early human brains to evolve so fast. Fishing has also dictated our entire global geography. Almost every single major and powerful ancient and modern civilization has been founded on waterways for many reasons, as well as the fact that fishing always gives a reliable safety net when agriculture fails. Actually, fishing has really constructed the modern world map. Hundreds of years ago, the chase for cod and herring made some of the first international trade routes and started the growth of global naval empires, and literally paid for the colonization of new continents. And when it comes to eating them, dried, salted fish was a mass commodity. It was a food source that could last a substantial amount of time, which fueled exploration in armies all across the globe. Next up, I'm doing the frame. It's made out of an 1/8 inch thick brass bar. Working with the brass is quite a bit different than the wood, so I'm using a fine-tooth hacksaw and a little bit of oil so it doesn't stick or bind. If we look into the history of fishing tackle, we can see how the introduction of metal frames like the one I'm working on has changed the whole way reels were made. For hundreds of years, fishing tools were made almost completely out of organics, wood, bone, horsehair, and animal sinew. Early reels in 3rd century China and later in Europe in the 1600s were just simple wooden blocks or wire cages that held spare line. In the mid-19th century, the increase in specialized clockmaking and metallurgy in England, like gunsmiths and watchmakers, start to manufacture standardized brass and steel parts. As a result of that, fishermen quickly figured out that while wooden spools were cheap and light, a wooden frame would warp, swell, and split when exposed to water and too much line tension. Switching to a brass backplate solved that problem and allowed the reel to keep its shape under the pressure of bigger fish. Bringing all the components together showed some more challenges for the project at the end. I started by cutting the main axle down to size with my hacksaw, And then I realized I had forgot to cut the backplate down to size, so I did just that and re-drilled the axle hole. Once that was done, I was able to attach the axle to the frame by using a large drill bit to open up the backplate a little and hammering the back of the axle to bend the brass into place, sealing it and keeping it locked. With the main structure done, I realized that the curve was too shallow for the reel to fit safely underneath, so I improvised a spacer out of leftover walnut to keep the reel in a safe spot. Next, I realized that the base plate of the back plate was too wide to attach to the reel, so I cut it down to size with a hacksaw and filed it smooth. Next, I made the handle out of some spare walnut I had, whittling, sawing, rasping, and finally sanding it down to size. Once I was done with all the wood parts, I coated them all in a coat of boiled linseed oil to give them a little more protection and bring out their walnut warmth. I used a 3/32-inch drill bit to make a pilot hole for the handle in the reel, then mounted the handle with number 5 5/8-inch screws. And just like that, the reel is done. After seeing how everything went together, let's see what compares to a modern fly reel. Putting these next to each other, it's very interesting how the fundamental mechanics have stayed pretty much the same, but how specific materials and features have evolved far from their primitive initial design. But first, let's look at the similarities. The core architecture hasn't changed much at all because the basic physics of holding and paying out fly line are almost exactly the same. Both of these are single-action, direct drive systems. There are no internal gears or multipliers here. One full turn of the handle gives you exactly one rotation of the spool. They also have the exact same geometry, a wide, deep channel for the line, with 2 flat outer walls on either side. Even the brass foot matches the modern reel because they both have to lock into very similar rod seats that people have been using for generations. Where things really split, though, is how manufacturers solve the exact problems I ran into during this build. The original wooden spool is basically completely unsealed, and back in the day, people realized that as the wood absorbed water, it swelled up and warped, which ruins your tolerances and causes the spool to bind against the backplate. To fix that, companies eventually dropped wood altogether and switched to things like plastics and machined aluminum, which stays completely stable no matter how wet it gets. Line control was another big issue, because a traditional center pin axle just spins completely free on a basic sleeve like the one here. A fast fish can easily spin the spool way faster than the line can peel off, giving you a massive bird's nest. The manual handbraking you have to do against the wooden rim is the exact reason companies started engineering internal friction systems, leading first to the basic click and pull, but eventually to the multi-disc carbon fiber and Teflon drag setups we can commonly find now. Even the line itself has upgraded. Traditional braided silk held onto water like a sponge and would literally rot a wooden spool from the inside out if you didn't strip it off and dry it after every single fishing trip. That massive maintenance headache is what pushed the chemical industry to invent modern synthetic fly lines. It's a braided nylon core with a PVC coating that sheds water instantly, meaning you don't have to baby your gear. And now, as you watch me try to cast this thing outside, I want you to keep in mind that I am a cat and bass fisherman, not a fly fisherman, so don't judge too harshly. But anyway, I hope you learned something in this video today, and thanks for watching.